The printer spat out 4 one-way tickets to Brazil. My name scratched out and replaced with a stranger's. My husband had already booked my erasure. Now I'm holding my kids' birth certificates with one hand and downloading his encrypted files with the other, because if I don't move fast, I won't just lose my family. I'll cease to exist. The front door rattles. They're here. I swing my medical bag like a weapon, hear bone crack, and slam the pantry door shut. My brother's voice crackles through the phone. "Sarah, run. That woman on your ticket? She's not his mistress. She's a professional cleaner." My passport's already flagged as stolen. The clock's ticking. I have minutes before I become a ghost. The kitchen smelled of stale coffee and the metallic tang of the radiator. Sarah Miller slid the utility knife through the envelope's seam, the rasp of paper echoing against the linoleum floor. 4 notices spilled onto the laminate table. Each one bore the same bold, crimson stamp. Final notice. Eviction pending. Her thumb traced the embossed seal of the county court. The paper felt thick, expensive, a sharp contrast to the frayed edges of her sleeve. In the next room, the rhythmic thud of Leo's soccer ball hit the drywall. Sarah stared at the dates. 4 days until the locks changed. She folded the notices into narrow strips, tucking them beneath the stack of unpaid medical bills in the bread box. Her pulse drummed against her collarbone. She gripped the edge of the counter until her knuckles turned the color of bone. The front door creaked open, admitting a gust of damp November air and the scent of wood smoke. "Mom, did the mail come?" Sarah turned, forcing her shoulders to drop. Maya stood in the doorway, clutching her backpack straps, eyes scanning the cluttered table. "Nothing but coupons," Sarah said. She reached for the kettle, her hand trembling as she fumbled with the plastic switch. "Go help your brother find his sneaker. We're leaving in 5 minutes." Maya lingered, her gaze lingering on the bread box. "You're shaking." "It's cold in here, Maya. Move." Sarah shoved her hands into her pockets, hiding the tremor. The kettle began to hiss, a low, rising whistle that filled the hollow silence of the house. As the children's footsteps retreated upstairs, Sarah moved toward the family iMac in the home office. The room was David's sanctuary, smelling of expensive leather and cedarwood. She sat in his ergonomic chair, the mesh cool against her back, and woke the screen. A browser tab was left open, an oversight so rare for David it felt like a trap. Her breath hitched. There, glowing in the clinical blue light, were 4 one-way tickets to Brazil. She leaned closer, her hazel eyes scanning the flight details. Departure, 6 a.m. tomorrow. Airline, Latam. But as her gaze drifted to the passenger names, the air left her lungs as if she'd been struck in the solar plexus. David Miller, Leo Miller, Maya Miller. The 4th name wasn't Sarah. It was Allison Vance. Sarah's fingers flew to her wrist, pressing hard against the radial artery. Thump, 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 100 beats per minute. She wasn't imagining this. She was being deleted. The woman she had shared a bed with for 12 years was erasing her from the family itinerary, replacing her with a ghost named Allison. The clinical reality of it hit her before the emotion did. This was a total system failure. She couldn't afford to scream. She had to triage. Sarah reached into the desk drawer and pulled out a high-capacity thumb drive she'd bought for her nursing continuing education credits. Her hands, usually steady enough to draw blood from a collapsing vein, shook as she jammed the drive into the side of the silver monitor. She navigated to David's cloud storage. He was a senior partner at a top-tier law firm. His files were a fortress, but she knew his perfectionist password. the date of his father's first major court victory, followed by the number of steps in their front porch. The progress bar began to crawl, copying 4.2 gigabytes. Every second felt like a drop of heavy lead hitting a tin roof. While the data pulsed through the wire, Sarah dropped to her knees and began clawing at the back of the bottom desk drawer. She found the false panel. Inside were the children's original birth certificates, their social security cards, and their immunization records. These weren't just papers. They were the only proof that Leo and Maya belonged to her. Without them, she was just a woman claiming to be a mother in a world that demanded receipts. She stuffed the documents into her medical bag, the heavy canvas smelling of antiseptic and old bandages. A floorboard groaned in the hallway. Sarah froze, her fingers gripping the birth certificates. It wasn't the light, rhythmic step of a child. It was a heavy, deliberate tread. The back door, which she had locked minutes ago, clicked open. "Mrs. Miller?" A voice boomed, deep, resonant, and entirely unfamiliar. Sarah scrambled to her feet, snatching the thumb drive from the computer just as the progress bar vanished. She retreated into the kitchen, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Standing by the island was a man who looked like a mountain dressed in a tactical vest. He wore a patch that read, "Sentry Global Security." "Who are you?" Sarah demanded, her voice sharp with the authority she used on unruly ER patients. "Get out of my house." "I have a court order, ma'am," the man said, his voice a low, weary rumble. He didn't look angry. He looked bored, which was worse. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded paper. "David Miller has filed an emergency restraining order. You're to vacate the premises immediately. No contact with the minor children." "That's a lie," Sarah hissed. "David is at work. This is a mistake." "No mistake, ma'am." The guard, whose name tag read Sullivan, stepped forward. His boots made a wet sucking sound on the linoleum. "The kids are coming with me. Their father is meeting us at a secure location." He lunged for her medical bag, his massive hand closing around the strap. Sarah didn't think. She reacted with the muscle memory of a woman who had spent a decade managing violent patients in the middle of the night. She swung the heavy bag with both hands. The metal bell of her high-end stethoscope caught Sullivan squarely across the temple with a sickening thwack. He grunted, his eyes rolling back as he stumbled into the pantry door. Sarah didn't wait for him to recover. She shoved him backward into the small, dark room filled with canned goods and cereal boxes. He hit the floor hard. She slammed the door shut and threw the heavy brass bolt. "Leo, Maya, car, now!" she screamed. The children tumbled down the stairs, eyes wide with terror. They didn't ask questions. They saw the look on their mother's face, the look of a surgeon who had just found a terminal bleed. They sprinted for the SUV in the driveway. Sarah threw the car into reverse just as a black sedan turned the corner of their quiet suburban street. She didn't stay to see if it was David. She floored the accelerator, the tires screaming against the asphalt, leaving a trail of burnt rubber behind. She drove 3 towns over, her eyes constantly flicking to the rearview mirror. Every pair of headlights felt like a searchlight. She pulled into the gravel lot of a dilapidated warehouse on the edge of the industrial district. This was Marcus's world. Her brother, the ex-cop who had traded his badge for a life of shadows and silence, lived in a loft that felt more like a bunker. Marcus met them at the door, his eyes scanning the street before he pulled them inside. He didn't offer a hug. He offered a perimeter check. The loft smelled of gun oil and old paper. "He's moved the money, Sarah," Marcus said, his voice a gravelly rasp. He was hunched over a bank of monitors, his fingers flying across a keyboard. "It's not just a divorce. David's been skimming from the firm's pro bono accounts for years. Millions. He's not going to Brazil for a vacation. He's going because the FBI is about 48 hours away from kicking in his office door. Sarah sat Leo and Maya on a tattered sofa, giving them tablets to keep them occupied. I have his files on this drive. Marcus took the thumb drive, but his face remained grim. He tapped a few keys, and a red warning flashed on his screen. It doesn't matter what's on here yet. Look at this. He turned the monitor toward her. It was a restricted law enforcement database. Sarah's breath hitched. Her own photo appeared on the screen, but across it, in bold digital ink, was the word deceased/identity theft veteran. He didn't just replace you on a ticket, Marcus whispered. He used his connections to flag your passport as stolen and your social security number as part of a fraud investigation. And this woman, Allison Vance? She's not his mistress. She's a professional cleaner. She specializes in erasing people. She's already taken over your digital footprint. Sarah felt a cold, prickling sensation wash over her. It was the feeling of blood leaving the extremities, the body's way of preparing for a fatal blow. He's stealing my life, Marcus. He's taking them to a country with no extradition, and I won't even exist to go after them. We have to find where they are now, Marcus said, grabbing his tactical jacket. I tracked the kids' GPS tablets to your mother-in-law's estate in the Heights. If we move now, we can intercept them before they head to O'Hare. They piled into Marcus's rugged truck. The rain began to fall, a cold, needle-like drizzle that blurred the world into shades of gray. Marcus drove with a professional's intensity, avoiding left turns with an obsessive dedication that Sarah knew was born of his own trauma. As they neared the sprawling Moore estate, a fortress of mahogany and old money, Marcus glanced at his tablet. The two blue dots representing the children's tablets were steady. Almost there, Marcus muttered. Just another mile. Suddenly, the screen flickered. The blue dots blinked once, twice, and then vanished into a black void. What happened? Sarah asked, her voice rising. Why did they stop? Marcus cursed under his breath, tapping the screen with a scarred knuckle. The signal is dead. They didn't just turn them off. They fried them. They knew we were coming. The silence in the truck was heavy, broken only by the rhythmic slap of the windshield wipers. Sarah felt the walls closing in. David wasn't just running. He was hunting. Subverted beat 2.2. The realization that they were blind sent a surge of desperation through Sarah's veins. We need help, Marcus. Real help, not just shadows and hacks. If he's flagged my ID, I need to go to the police and show them the birth certificates. I need to prove I'm real before he can do anything else. Marcus hesitated, his jaw tight. Sarah, the system is rigged right now. David's a lawyer. He knows how to use the law as a garrote. I have the documents, Sarah insisted, clutching her medical bag. The birth certificates are original. They have the raised seals. No one can fake those. If I go to the precinct in the Heights, they have to listen. It's a wealthy area. They're used to family disputes. I can freeze the kids' travel status. It was a logical, smart move. In any other world, the law was a shield. Sarah believed in the power of the record, the sanctity of the official seal. They pulled into the parking lot of the 4th Precinct, a clean brick building that smelled of floor wax and burnt coffee. Sarah walked up to the sergeant's desk with a confident stride, her nursing badge pinned to her coat for extra authority. I need to report a kidnapping in progress, Sarah said, her voice clear and steady. My husband, David Miller, is attempting to flee the country with our children. Here are their birth certificates and my ID. The officer, A gray-haired man named Miller, no relation, took the papers. He looked at them and then back at Sarah. He offered a small, sympathetic smile. "Just a moment, ma'am. Let me run the names through the system." Sarah felt a wave of relief. This was how it was supposed to work. You go to the authorities, you show your proof, and the machine grinds to a halt for the bad guys. She looked over her shoulder at Marcus, who stood by the door, and gave him a small nod. "See?" she thought. "Logic wins." Officer Miller returned a minute later. He didn't hand back the papers. Instead, he rested his hands on the belt of his uniform, near his radio. "Mrs. Miller, I'm glad you came in. We've actually been looking for you." Sarah's smile faltered. "Looking for me? To help?" "Not exactly." The officer's voice was soft, patronizing. "Your husband filed an emergency wellness report 3 hours ago. He provided documentation from your primary care physician and a court-appointed psychologist. It seems there's a history of severe paranoid episodes? Delusions regarding identity theft? What? No, that's... He says you've been off your medication, Sarah. He provided photos of the house. You've been destroying things, looking for trackers in the walls." The crack in the world opened beneath her feet. Sarah realized with a sickening jolt that David hadn't just erased her. He had preemptively diagnosed her. Every action she had taken to save herself, the frantic searching, the flight, the assault on the security guard, would now be framed as the symptoms of a mental breakdown. "I have the files," Sarah shouted, reaching for her bag. "He's embezzling. He's a criminal." "Easy, ma'am," the officer said, his hand moving to his handcuffs. "That's exactly what the report said you'd say. Grandiosity and accusations of financial conspiracy. I need you to step behind the counter. We have a medical transport on the way to take you for an evaluation." The truth hit Sarah like a physical blow. The birth certificates she'd brought weren't her salvation. They were the bait that had lured her into a cage. By trying to use the law, she had handed herself over to the very person who controlled it. She wasn't a mother seeking justice anymore. She was a patient who needed to be contained. "Marcus!" she screamed. Marcus was already moving. He didn't draw a weapon. He grabbed a heavy fire extinguisher from the wall and slammed it into the glass partition. The shatter was deafening. In the chaos of the exploding glass and the officer's startled shout, Marcus lunged across the desk, grabbed Sarah by the arm, and hauled her toward the back exit. They burst out into the rain, the sirens behind them already beginning their mournful wail. Sarah tumbled into the truck, her heart thundering. She had lost the birth certificates. She had lost her standing. And now she was a fugitive from the very people she had gone to for help. "I told you," Marcus hissed, flooring the gas. In David's world, the truth is whatever he writes on the letterhead. They retreated to the only place left, the woods surrounding the Moore estate. If the GPS had gone dark there, the kids were likely still on the grounds, being prepared for the final leg of the journey. The estate was a sprawling nightmare of manicured lawns and dark, towering oaks. Sarah and Marcus moved through the muddy perimeter, the scent of wet earth and decaying leaves filling Sarah's nose. Her nursing shoes were ruined, caked in heavy, gray clay that made every step a struggle. "Movement," Marcus whispered, pulling her behind a massive elm. A security guard, younger than Sullivan but just as rigid, was patrolling the fence line. He carried a heavy tactical flashlight that sliced through the dark like a blade. Sarah watched him, her mind automatically calculating his gait, his weight, the way he favored his left leg. "We have to take him out," Marcus said. quietly. Marcus moved like a shadow, but the mud betrayed him. A branch snapped, a sound like a gunshot in the damp silence. The guard turned, his light catching Marcus in the chest. "Hey, stay where you are!" the guard shouted, reaching for his radio. Marcus lunged, but the guard was fast. They collided in the mud, a brutal, wet struggle of limbs and heavy breathing. The guard was winning, his forearm pressed against Marcus's throat. Sarah didn't hesitate. She didn't have a weapon, but she had a map of the human nervous system. She scrambled through the muck and drove her thumb into the cluster of nerves just below the guard's ear, the carotid sinus. At the same time, she used her other hand to strike the brachial plexus in his shoulder. The guard's arm went limp. His eyes glazed over as his blood pressure plummeted, a temporary but total system override. He slumped into the mud, unconscious before he hit the ground. "Nice work," Marcus wheezed, rubbing his throat. "It'll last 5 minutes," Sarah said, her voice clinical. "Move." They breached the guest house, a smaller version of the main mansion. Sarah's heart leaped as she saw a light in the upstairs window. She climbed the stairs, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She pushed open the door to the master bedroom, expecting to see Leo and Maya. The room was empty. The air smelled of expensive lilies and floor wax. But there, in the center of the pristine white duvet, sat a single, fresh orchid. Sarah froze. The orchid was a cattleya, the exact flower David had given her on their first anniversary. She was deathly allergic to its pollen. The last time she'd been near one, her throat had closed in minutes. It was a message. "I see you. I know you're here. And you're too late." "They're gone," Sarah whispered, her voice breaking. It was a decoy. He knew we'd follow the GPS here. Marcus was already at the bedside table, looking at a discarded piece of paper in the trash can. "It's not over. Look, an invoice from a private car service. Destination, O'Hare International, signature flight support." "The private terminal," Sarah said, her hazel eyes sharpening. "He's not going through the main gate. He's using a private jet." "We have 2 hours," Marcus said. "If we hit the tollway now, we might make it." The drive to O'Hare was a blur of neon lights and rain-slicked asphalt. Sarah sat in the passenger seat, her fingers constantly checking her pulse. Thump, 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 thump. She felt like she was fading, becoming a ghost in her own life. They reached the airport perimeter, but the main entrance was swarming with police cruisers, likely looking for Marcus's truck after the precinct breakout. "We can't go in the front," Marcus said. He pulled onto a service road, a narrow strip of cracked concrete that ran alongside the massive fuel tanks. "I know a way into the maintenance tunnels. It'll get you into Terminal 3. From there, you can reach the gate." "What about you?" "I'll draw them off," Marcus said, his eyes meeting hers for the first time. "If they see the truck, they'll follow me. You get to the kids. You use those files, Sarah. Don't let him win." Sarah squeezed his hand, a rare moment of physical contact, and slipped out of the truck. She used her old, expired hospital ID to trick the card reader at a side door. The magnetic lock clicked, a sound of hope in the dark. Inside, the airport was a chaotic symphony of roaring engines and shouting voices. Sarah moved through the crowds, her head down, her heart racing. She reached the gate for the Brazil flight, just as the final boarding call echoed through the terminal. And then, she saw him. David was standing near the jet bridge, looking as calm and polished as if he were waiting for a morning commute. He was wearing one of his numbered white shirts, his silver-rimmed glasses catching the overhead lights. Next to him was a woman with blonde, suburban mom hair, Allison Vance. She was holding Maya's hand. Leo was standing close to David, looking small and terrified. "David!" Sarah screamed, her voice tearing through the ambient noise of the terminal. David turned. He didn't look surprised. He looked disappointed. He leaned over and whispered something to a pair of nearby airport police officers, pointing a long, elegant finger at Sarah. "Help!" David shouted, his voice carrying a practiced note of alarm. "That's her. That's the woman I told you about. She's been stalking my children." The officers moved instantly. Sarah tried to run, but David stepped into her path, his hand closing around her upper arm with the strength of a vice. He leaned in, his breath smelling of peppermint and cold steel. "You don't exist, Sarah," he whispered into her ear. "I've filed the papers. I've moved the money. By the time this plane lands, Sarah Miller will be a footnote in a missing persons file. Allison is their mother now. She has the records to prove it." Subverted beat 3.4. Sarah felt a surge of cold fury. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the thumb drive Marcus had returned to her. "I have the evidence, David. I have the files from your cloud, the embezzlement, the offshore accounts. It's all here. If you don't let them go, I'll hand this to every news outlet in the city." She felt a moment of pure triumph. This was the smoking gun, the logical conclusion to her struggle. She had the data, and the data was truth. David's eyes flickered to the small plastic drive in her hand. For a second, his composure broke. He looked vulnerable. "Sarah, let's be reasonable," he said, his voice dropping. "We can talk about this." He reached out, his hand open in a gesture of peace. Sarah felt her shoulders drop. She had won. The fixer had fixed the unfixable. She began to extend her hand, ready to negotiate for her children's lives. But as her fingers brushed his, David's expression shifted. The vulnerability vanished, replaced by a predatory sharpness. He didn't take the drive. He snatched it from her fingers with a violent jerk. "Reasonable," David sneered. "You've always been so naive, Sarah. You think a plastic toy can stop me?" Before she could react, David dropped the thumb drive onto the hard, industrial carpet of the terminal. He brought his heel down with a sickening crunch. The plastic shattered, and the delicate green circuit board inside snapped into a dozen useless pieces. He ground the remains into the floor with his shoe until there was nothing left but dust. "There goes your truth," David whispered. Sarah stared at the wreckage of her only hope. The physical loss of the data felt like a limb being severed. She had put everything into that drive, her brother's safety, her own future, the proof of David's crimes. And in one arrogant moment, she had handed it to him. You destroyed it," she gasped. "I destroyed a nuisance," David corrected. He looked up at the approaching officers. "Officer, she just tried to assault me. She's dangerous." The officers tackled Sarah to the ground. The cold floor pressed against her cheek. She watched, her vision blurred by tears of rage, as David turned his back on her. He took Leo and Maya by the shoulders and led them toward the jet bridge. "Mom!" Leo screamed, his voice fading into the roar of the engines. "Take her to the holding room," the sergeant barked. "We'll wait for the medical transport." Sarah was dragged through a maze of sterile corridors, her feet sparking against the linoleum. They threw her into a windowless room that smelled of ozone and old cigarettes. The heavy steel door slammed shut, the lock engaging with a final, echoing thud. She was alone. She had no ID, no money, no evidence, and no children. She sat on the floor, her back against the cold wall. Thump, 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 thump. Her pulse was slow now, the rhythm of a body in shock. She looked at her hands, stained with mud from the estate and grease from the maintenance tunnels. She looked like a ghost. But then, she felt a small, hard object in the lining of her coat. She reached in and pulled out her phone. It was the burner Marcus had given her, the one she'd used to sync the drive earlier. She remembered the verification loop she'd set up, a nursing habit of double-checking every vital. She hadn't just copied the files to the drive. She had set up a live sync to a secure cloud server, one that updated every time the drive was plugged into a networked computer. When she'd plugged it into the iMac, it had started a background upload to Richard Bennett, the firm's senior partner. David had crushed the drive, but he hadn't crushed the cloud. Sarah stood up. She didn't feel like a victim anymore. She felt like a surgeon who had just found the source of the infection. She began to shake, not with fear, but with a calculated, rhythmic tremor. She dropped to the floor and began to thrash, her eyes rolling back in her head. She made a guttural, choking sound, the sound of a grand mal seizure. The guard outside the door peeked through the small glass window. "Hey, what's going on in there?" Sarah didn't answer. She kicked the table, sending it crashing against the wall. The door flew open. "Medic! I need a medic in holding 4. The guard rushed in, leaning over her. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" As he reached for his radio, Sarah's hand shot out. She didn't hit him. She grabbed the lanyard around his neck and yanked him down, her knee finding his solar plexus with clinical precision. He wheezed, the air leaving his lungs in a sharp gasp. She snatched his master keycard and her phone from the table. She didn't run for the exit. She ran for the gate. She reached the departure lounge just as the gate agent was about to close the heavy steel door. David was standing at the end of the jet bridge, looking back one last time. "David!" Sarah yelled. He turned, his face contorting in rage. "You again? How did you—" "I didn't need the drive, David," Sarah shouted, her voice amplified by the acoustics of the terminal. "I sent the files to Richard Bennett an hour ago. He knows about the pro bono fund. He knows about Brazil." David stepped back onto the terminal floor, his ego overriding his survival instinct. He couldn't let her have the last word. He walked toward her, his face a mask of cold, aristocratic fury. "Richard is a fool," David hissed, grabbing her by the shoulders. "He'll never prove it. I earned that money. I built that firm while those old men slept. You're nothing, Sarah. You're a nurse. You're a footnote." He didn't notice the overhead speakers. He didn't notice that Sarah had reached out and pressed the page button on the gate agent's desk. His confession, his admission of the theft, his dismissal of the law, echoed through the entire terminal, recorded by the airport security system and heard by every passenger waiting to board. The 2 officers who had detained Sarah earlier stepped out from behind a pillar. They weren't looking at Sarah anymore. They were looking at David. "Mr. Miller?" one of them said, his hand on his holster. "We just got a high-priority fraud alert from the state's attorney's office. You need to come with us." David froze. He looked at the officers, then at the speakers, then at Sarah. The perfectionist finally saw the flaw in his plan. He had been so focused on erasing her that he had forgotten that a ghost can still scream. Allison Vance tried to slip away into the crowd, but Marcus was there. He had doubled back, his truck abandoned, and he blocked her path with a grim, silent intensity. "Allison Vance?" Marcus said. "Or should I say, Special Agent Vance. The FBI has been looking for you since the Chicago field office lost that evidence 3 years ago." The airport police moved in, the zip ties clicking into place around David's wrists. He didn't shout. He didn't fight. He just stared at Sarah, his eyes cold and empty, as if he were already filing her away in a cabinet he could no longer reach. Sarah didn't watch him go. She turned and ran down the jet bridge. Leo, Maya. The children were sitting in the first-row seats of the plane, looking confused and terrified. When they saw Sarah, they broke into sobs, throwing themselves into her arms. Sarah held them, her face pressed into Leo's messy hair. She smelled the scent of the airport, jet fuel and stale air. But beneath it, she smelled her children. They walked back into the terminal as the sun began to rise over the runways, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and gold. Sarah sat them down on a quiet bench, away from the flashing lights and the shouting. She looked at her reflection in the glass. Her hair was a mess, her clothes were stained with mud, and her legal identity was still a tangled wreck that would take years to unknot. But as she pressed her fingers to her wrist, the rhythm was different. It wasn't the frantic beat of a victim or the clinical pulse of a nurse. It was the steady, heavy thrum of a woman who had fought her way back from the edge of the world. Thump, 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 thump. "Are we going home, Mom?" Maya asked, her voice small. Sarah looked out at the horizon, at the planes taking off into the new day. "No, baby," she said, her voice stronger than it had been in years. "We're going to start something new." She took their hands and led them toward the exit, her shadow long and sharp against the terminal floor. She was Sarah Miller. She existed. And that was enough.